Right, so my topic for this morning is calculation and socialism. And I'm going to really focus on a particular article by Ludwig von Mises, which I consider to be the greatest article in economics written in the 20th century, and maybe in the history of economic thought, as an article. I'm not comparing it to books. It did two things, and it did them definitively. It completely destroyed the intellectual foundations of socialism. And that in itself was a great achievement. But it was also a revolutionary breakthrough in price theory, okay? Following on Menger, Mises showed the importance of pricing in an economy, the importance to human welfare, and did it in a way that really couldn't be refuted. So I highly recommend, we have this in pamphlet form. There's an introduction or an epilogue by a notable modern Austrian in this booklet. So make sure you read that too. It's at the end. Salerno. Okay. Let me just start with the difference between two groups of socialists. One were the so-called Utopian socialists. They were the earlier socialists. And the other was scientific socialists. And that was, scientific socialism was developed by Karl Marx. And it was really a polemical ploy. It wasn't an actual system, but it was a way to shut the Utopian socialists up, who were all crazy, as we'll see. I'll give you an example of that. This is Charles Fourier, a French socialist. You can tell by his face he's up to no good, right? I mean, it's the opposite of human welfare. He came up, just to outline his nutty ideas, he came up with something called the phalanstère, which refers to a Roman military formation. He said that under in his world of socialism, and they all had every single socialist had their own little method of implementing socialism. So his was that there would be 1,500 to 1,600 residents, which was a Roman phalanx, as I said, a military formation, or an ancient Greek military formation. They would live in a huge grand hotel style house or building. Each would purchase their own accommodations according to their individual tastes and income. All residents would be a stockholder in the city. There would be collective production. All tasks would be cooperation. Not much about the division of labor, which we saw from Professor Jonathan Newman, is so important to a modern economy. All would share meals in a communal kitchen, and the dirty work would all be shared. Okay. So there was a sketch that he had made of the phalanstère. Now notice how symmetrical it is. All of these socialists had a mania for symmetry. Everything had to be symmetrical and look very nice and so on. He even had a model of it built. And so that's the vision of his socialist utopia. That's the reality. That's actually near my house or my home in New Jersey, where I live half the year, and it's still standing. And it was abandoned pretty quickly after the group of socialists moved in. Let me just talk about some of his ramblings very quickly. So I'm setting it up so that you see why Marx came up with this notion of scientific socialism. He according to Fourier, 19th century France was in the fifth stage of advancement, all right? They passed through confusion, savagery, patriarchism, barbarity. After passing through two more stages, it would approach the upward slope of harmony, the final stage of utter bliss, which would last for 8,000 years. Now, how does he know all of these things? Well, every socialist has a gnosis, an intuition, a secret source of knowledge that only they are privy to, and no one else can figure out why or where this comes from. They have to take the head socialist at his or her word. However, after you've gone through this harmony for 8,000 years, history reverses itself, okay, and it runs back to the beginning. Also, some other things. It gets better. Fourier said that the changes that would accompany harmony, 6 new moons would replace the one in existence. Okay, a halo showering gentle dew would circle the North Pole. The seas would turn to Kool-Aid or whatever juice they would, children's drink they would have back then. All violent or repulsive, this is great, I like this. All violent or repulsive beasts would be replaced by their opposites and would be commonplace, and they would serve mankind. Anti-lions would offer themselves to humans to be ridden, and roasted anti-chickens would fly into human mouths. The human lifespan in the harmonic stage, that final stage of 8,000 years, would stretch to 144 years, and 5/6 of this, 5/6, not 7/8, of the time would be devoted to the unrestrained pursuit of sexual love. That's always, since men are, for the most part, were the ones who came up with these schemes, that's always a part of this. Free love is always a part of these utopian socialist schemes. Okay, so all of this embarrassed Marx, okay, who was a radical socialist, a communist from the very early days. The classical economists we talked about, they didn't have a completely consistent and correct system of economics, but they were just with their simple supply and demand, they were able to smash all the utopian socialists. Okay, and they basically asked the question, who will take out the garbage under socialism? So it was an incentive problem. They saw socialism as an incentive problem. And they did point out that the price system would help entrepreneurs allocate resources to the most valuable wants. So as Mises pointed out, the classical economic system was a system of calculated action. It just wasn't traced back to consumers. That was the problem with the classical school. But they knew enough and were smart enough and insightful enough to smash the socialists. The socialist answer was very weak. It was, oh, well, there'll be a new socialist man and woman. They would be magically or mystically transformed into someone who worked not for money, but for the common welfare. Okay, but both sides assumed it was only an incentive problem. That socialism would be as productive as capitalism if you could solve the incentive problem. So that's where the debate stood when Mises wrote his article. Okay. Now, as I said, just to talk about Marx for a moment, he realized the harm that these crazy scribblings of the utopian socialists did. You know, the classical economists smashed them, people laughed at them. So he devised the system or the ideology of scientific socialism. And he said, look, we don't know what the future socialist society is going to look like, nor do we care, okay? The inexorable, what he called the inexorable laws of history dictated that socialism would replace capitalism just as capitalism replaced feudalism, just as feudalism replaced classical slave systems. It was a march towards socialism and eventually communism. There was sort of a difference between the stages, which I won't get into. Therefore, anyone who said anything about what the future socialist society may look like was unscientific. The laws of history had spoken. This is how things were going to develop. So to try to for the puny human mind to try to figure out what the laws of history had in store for mankind was totally unscientific. So therefore, his writings, so think about his main writing, Das Kapital, Capital. All he wrote about, he didn't write about the socialist society, he wrote about the capitalism and its contradictions, why it was going to fall apart. Okay, he would only go that far, that it would fall apart and socialism would succeed capitalism. Okay, so that's where everything stood. Mises wanted to break down this whole idea of scientific socialism. He wanted to take a look at what socialism would look like and how it could perform beyond the incentive problem. So his thesis was very simple. It was called the impossibility thesis. Socialism was impossible because with complicated production processes and multitudes of capital goods and technology that allowed you to use those capital goods in many, many different, almost infinite combinations, an economy was impossible with calculation with cardinal numbers being the prices. So it was impossible because it could not generate prices for capital goods and natural resources. Why? Well, Mises had a very straightforward, step-by-step, simple to understand rationale for his claim. First, socialism abolishes private property. That's how it is defined. There was a great book written by a German teacher of Menger who had some socialist leanings. His name was Schaeffler, and it's called the Essence of Socialism. And so he looked at all the socialist schemes through history, and he said they all came down to one thing: the abolition of private property. So that's how Mises defines socialism, as the abolition of private property in the material means of production, not in your own body, but in capital goods and natural resources. Since a socialist state would abolish private property, it would become the sole owner of all resources. That being the case, there would be no exchange. Okay? The socialist state would monopolize all resources, so there couldn't be any exchange, which means there couldn't be any markets or prices. Therefore, with no prices, the state would be unable to calculate costs of production. They may be able to if they allow people to get paid, which isn't necessarily ruled out by socialism. If they allow them to get paid in money, there could be consumer prices, but you couldn't compare them to costs, because there would be no cost of production. They couldn't be calculated because of the fact that there's no exchange of capital goods and natural resources. And that being the case, you could never figure out profit or loss. You could never figure out where the more important uses of resources were and where the less important uses that should be avoided are. So that was Mises' argument. Okay, it was a devastating argument. The socialists were sent into a tizzy, at least in Germany in the 20s. It didn't reach the English-speaking world until the 1930s, the debate. So they all tried to answer Mises, and I'll talk about some of their answers towards the end. But here is the point for Mises. Now, some Austrians claim that the reason why socialism can't calculate is because they can't use all the dispersed knowledge that's in the heads of different consumers and entrepreneurs and resource owners. But that's not the essence of socialism. The essence is that when you abolish private property and set up a monopoly, you only have one will that controls the allocation of those resources. And with one will, okay, even if it's a group of people, men and women together, who are the central planning board, with one will, there can be no exchange. There can be no difference in value scales. So Mises wrote, and this is worth quoting, the essential mark of socialism is that one will alone acts. It's not that different people have different knowledge and we can't combine it. That's a problem, but that's not the essential problem. It is immaterial whose will it is. So it could be an angel, it could be a devil, it could be a good guy, a bad guy. The main thing is that the employment of all factors of production is directed by one agency only. One will alone chooses, decides, directs, acts, gives orders. The distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will, directing all production activities within the whole social system. Because one person or group of people not having access to calculation, not having access to prices, cannot figure out the best use of these hundreds of thousands of different resources in different locations, which can be combined in an almost infinite, especially in a modern economy, infinite number of combinations, okay? How do you know exactly, if you were put in charge of the U.S. economy right now, and let's say you were cut off from all world prices, so you're the czar of the U.S. economy, and you have all of these capital goods, everything that exists in the U.S. and all these natural resources, how would you figure out the one combination of all of these resources that would optimize or best serve consumer demand at the lowest possible cost? It would be impossible. It would be like put in the middle of a desert, trying to get to a particular location, not having a compass, and not knowing where you exactly are, okay? So what are the preconditions of economic calculation? First of all, private property in all stages of goods, not just in consumer goods, but in capital goods and natural resources, in land, in forests, in streams, and so on. The second is freedom. Not only do you have to have private property, but you have to be able to exchange these goods. There has to be markets for all goods, not just consumer goods, but for capital goods and so on. And there has to be sound money. So when you see the prices, those prices aren't falsified by the creation of new money, okay? So we've never had all of these preconditions in a pure sense, but for the most part, in real world capitalist economies, that has existed, okay? So, given that socialism abolishes all three of these preconditions of calculation, it not only abolishes economic calculation, it abolishes what Dr. Newman talked about yesterday, the division of labor, which is so important to the productivity of an economy, and it abolishes society itself. Okay. So let's look at the problem with socialist central planning. We're not saying that socialists can't produce things. They can produce a lot of different things. They're scientists. Certainly in Soviet Russia, their scientists were as competent as our scientists, and their engineers also could do the same things that Western engineers could do. And they had the technical knowledge. So let's say somebody wants to, the Commissar or the Central Planning Board is deciding on whether to produce a certain model car. He knows the production function. The production function is what we call in economics, we use that term in economics to refer to the recipe for building anything, for producing anything. So you would know that this car would need a specific amount of steel, P tons of steel, Q hours of machine time, certain number of hours of unskilled labor, a certain amount of engineering labor and factory space and so on. And you come out with this car, which is a beautiful car. It's a Cadillac CT5 Blackwing, which I've been looking at, but it's way out of my price range. But anyway, so you would know how to build it. The problem is, how can you decide whether or not to build it? How can we calculate the cost of producing this car under socialism? So in the market economy, we know that all resources, right now as we speak, all resources have prices. Steel, engineering services, electricity, factory space, all of them have prices. There is a structure of prices existing at every moment. It's changing continually, even as I speak. But there's always a set of prices of capital goods and natural resources that an entrepreneur who knows his product or her production function can then calculate the costs from. Okay, you can always calculate the cost for any, even if it's a crazy idea about producing something. You can calculate the cost because the price system exists and at every moment. Okay. So then let's assume that the average cost of producing this car is $60,000. Now firms, they don't know the selling price of this car. And let's say it goes for, it takes a number of years to bring it from the engineering's drawing board to the dealer's showroom, so that you have to forecast 3 or 4 years in the future. Well, even that's doable. Entrepreneurs can make educated guesses, educated forecasts based on their past experience and based on what they know about just present prices that they're just seeing. They can guess about how things will change and what price that car may sell for. Now, they're fallible human beings, they can be wrong. And if they're wrong, they'll waste resources. So let's assume that they believe the price will be $70,000. Well, that's a profitable endeavor. That means that they're using 60,000 resources that are worth $60,000 producing other things in society. They're combining them in a new way to produce an automobile that people value at $70,000. They're moving resources from lower value to higher valued uses. So they're benefiting society and themselves at the same time. On the other hand, if they forecast that the output price of this automobile will be $55,000, $5,000 less than its cost of production, then they know that they would be wasting resources. Now, some entrepreneurs may mistakenly think the future price is $70,000 and build it, and it turns out to be $55,000 or $50,000, and they lose money. Well, in that, we shouldn't feel sorry for them. Okay, in that case, they're wasting scarce resources. Those resources could have been used by other entrepreneurs who are bidding them. That's why the price is $60,000, right? The entrepreneurs are bidding them up in other areas of production to that level because they believe that's what the value they will add to the product that they will be producing. So they're wasting resources because their product has only returned 55,000. And so the value of the resources that we use were greater than the value to consumers of the output. Okay. Also, there are many different decisions to be made in building this automobile. And the bumper is one example. Should we use titanium, steel, or fiberglass for the bumper? Okay, we used to have steel bumpers, and we've moved to fiberglass bumpers. Okay, and there are reasons for doing that. Right, the more expensive and heavier steel bumpers just weren't raise the cost of the car without raising the value of the car by more than the cost of using the steel. Okay. Also, what technology is the best in the sense of the lowest cost technology, given what the product that you want? There's a big Kia firm, which is about 20 miles north of here on Route 85, and it's pretty much all robotic. So should we build a plant to build this car that uses a lot of robots and just a few guys that are pushing buttons? Or should we use a more standard or a more conventional type setup with an assembly line and laborers? Should we use more labor and less capital, more capital? They wouldn't know what to do, okay? And beyond that, they wouldn't know whether to produce 20,000 of these cars or 2 million bicycles. They wouldn't know which, assuming they use the same resources, they wouldn't know which was more valuable to consumers, okay? Because they can't calculate the costs and the revenues. Okay, so I have a friend I grew up with, a woman I grew up with, who actually married a real cowboy, somebody who actually owned a ranch out in Montana. And so this is about 15 years ago. I was talking to her, and she said, "Oh, we're getting a new house." I said, "Oh, you're moving off the ranch?" She said, "No, we're having a house delivered." I said, "What?" So evidently in Montana, where there's about 10 people, you don't have a lot of labor. Is very expensive. Okay. So capital, it's better to use a production to produce or a technology to produce a home that's capital intensive rather than labor intensive. So that home, which is not hers, but it's like hers, this is modularly built, was built in Omaha, 687 miles away from her house, from the site, and then shipped to Biddle, Montana, where she lives. And it was put there. It was put together there. It used a few laborers, but not as many as you would need to have on site to build a house right there. Now, could a socialist planner figure out that it's actually a better use of resources to build the house 687 miles away and then ship it? There'd be no way to figure that out. So this is because of calculation. Without calculation, okay, you couldn't make these kinds of decisions. You couldn't even conceive that this would be a better way of doing things. Skip over that. Now let's look at how production took place in the former Soviet Union. It was called gross output planning. Okay, so basically what they did was they set quantitative targets for each industry. Okay, so each industry was told to produce so many yards of cloth, so many tons of nails, so many pairs of shoes. Okay, there were no prices involved. They were given these gross output targets, that is, in terms of natural units, the units of the good itself. But when you do that, it's very difficult to specify the quality. So they ran into the quality of the nails, the sizes of the women's clothing that they were asking them to produce, and so on. So, for example, in the nail industry, and this is a true example, they were told to produce so many tons of nails. So all of the firms in that industry produce very heavy and large nails. So what we found was that there were a gross shortage of roofing nails. So there were many structures that were completely built in the Soviet Union didn't have roofs. And the reason why they didn't was because there weren't enough roofing nails. Okay. Other examples, women hated clothing that was produced because they were produced according to how many yards, or you were judged as a manager of a Soviet plant on the number of yards that your target was. So you wanted to, that's another thing. You wanted to meet your target, but you didn't want to go too much over, even if you could produce more than they were asking. Because if you produce more, then the next year they would say, you lied. We're going to increase your target. Okay. And if you didn't meet your target, you went to Siberia. So it was a mutual lying game. You would lie that, I can't produce that much. And they knew you were lying. So they would say, no, you can, would give you a bigger target. Okay. So you would just try to reach it and you would, and so on. Then there was the famous case of Khrushchev, the Soviet premier in the late 50s, early 60s, who told a story at the Politburo, which got out to the West, that he was bashing the chandelier producers in the Soviet Union, because it turns out that the dachas, the luxury villas that the party bigwigs lived in, the chandeliers were pulling the ceilings down and killing them because they were so heavy. Because they were stated in terms of how many pounds of chandeliers or tons of chandeliers you had to produce. Okay, so and then there's a famous joke about Hong Kong. Again, going back to Khrushchev, during the 1950s, he famously took his shoe off and banged it on the table at a UN meeting and said, "We will bury you," meaning we will economically bury the West because we have a much more productive economy. And the CIA believed that, by the way. The CIA thought that they were going to catch up to us. But in any case, Soviet economists, when they met with their Western counterparts, would kind of joke and say, "We will bury you, but we're going to leave Hong Kong so we can see the prices." And we can because that's exactly what they did. Okay. So here's the famous cartoon of the Soviet nail. This is you saying, "Well, comrade Kamazar, I met my target." So, it's like a 50-ton or 5,000-ton nail or something. And that was in a Soviet publication. Okay. So before we get to the social appraisement process, let me just mention the criticism of Mises, and that was, the Soviet Union lasted for 75 years. How could socialism be impossible if that were the case? But Mises met this argument in his very first article, the one that I mentioned at the beginning. Mises said the Soviet Union is like the post office in the middle of a free market economy, a government post office. It can use the technology and the pricing of the firms around it, okay, who are making things that were similar to it. So it wasn't a true socialist economy. A socialist economy would be one that was world embracing, or one in which you completely cut yourself off from the rest of the world. And also it engaged in foreign trade. It sold gold, electricity, diamonds to the West. So it had some information on prices. It used Western prices. It bought Western trade journals and catalogs and so on. Supposedly Red China had purchased or ordered thousands of Sears catalogs at some point. And so they could use the prices there. Now, that they weren't efficient prices because they weren't the prices of their resources, but they were prices of resources that were located elsewhere and that were very like the resources that they were using. So they could limp along uneconomically in that way. And also there was a system of black markets. Famously, Beatles records and denim jeans and many other things from the West were sold on this black market, and the government looked the other way. They also looked the other way on trade between different firms that bartered. If one firm had too much cloth and needed some extra steel, they would trade with the firm that had the excess of steel, and so then there were exchange ratios. So there was some kind of very rudimentary calculation going on there. The only period of true socialism occurred from 1917 to 1921. It's called war communism. It was when the war was being waged between the Bolsheviks, the Reds, and the white armies who supported the Tsar, or the return of the Tsar. And they were given an order by Lenin, the commissars, the heads of the various industries, to not look at any prices, not calculate with prices, but just come up with their targets in other ways, but not to use money or prices. So money and prices were abolished. And pretty soon the stores were empty and people were beginning to burn their furniture and other things just to keep warm. And then eventually they couldn't even live in the cities, and they just the cities emptied out, and they foraged for their subsistence in the countryside. So yeah, socialism can exist for nomadic tribes. I mean, if everybody's going out and hunting and sharing, I mean, that's the level at which it can exist. It cannot run a modern industrial economy, or even an industrial economy as it was in the 1920s. Okay. All right. So what Mises was talking about was what we call the social appraisement process. A very fancy name. It simply means that that the market economy determines prices through entrepreneurs looking ahead, forecasting what future consumer prices will be, and then based on these prices, bidding prices for the capital goods that they had to use to implement the technology to produce that good. Okay, so it allowed the entrepreneurs are continually bidding as we speak today for these resources, and that is causing a structure of prices for which you can use, if any of you are entrepreneurs, to produce any good that you think consumers will value more than the cost that you've laid out for it. Okay, I can't stress that enough. So they're the entrepreneurs in the middle of the whole process. Okay, so they're looking ahead, looking up at what prices they believe will be paid for various goods that they're thinking of producing in the future. And based on those prices and their experience, they're then bidding against each other for resources. And at the end of this bidding process, you have the costs that we all see and they can calculate with, and then the quantity of goods that are produced. And eventually, when those quantities of goods come out in the next several months or years, the demand of consumers determines their prices. Some entrepreneurs may be right, others may be wrong. The ones that are wrong lose money, they suffer losses. The ones that are right earn profits. And that, by the way, brings into a play a selective, what Mises called the selective process. The entrepreneurs that are right and earn profits are accumulating capital. They're becoming larger and larger players in the capital goods market. They're becoming the main deciders of how allocation or how the allocation of resources should be in the economy. Let me just mention something. There was a Star Trek episode many years ago, the original, the good one, in which there was a planet where there was an empath, somebody who could immediately absorb all of the emotions and values of the people around her. And so even if you could bethink someone like this, who could knew all the value scales of all the consumers, okay, and could give orders about what to be produced, even that person would not be able to arrange resources in a way that optimizes consumer satisfaction, okay, because that person is a single will and doesn't have any means of calculation. So Mises called this the intellectual division of labor. All of us play a part in generating these prices as consumers, as laborers, as resource owners, as entrepreneurs. Okay? So prices are genuinely a social phenomenon. We're always told that, well, society doesn't like this, or society doesn't like that, or this is a social phenomenon. Well, prices are really a social phenomenon. Each of us contributes a bit to its production in our choices about what to buy and what not to buy, where to work, where not to work, and so on. But none of us can create a price structure in our own minds, okay? It requires an intellectual division of knowledge, and that has nothing, of labor, and that has nothing to do with dispersed knowledge, okay? It has to do with the fact that people have different wills and different values and are interacting in a way that generates, voluntary exchange, generates the price structure. As I pointed out, number 3, the price structure allows entrepreneurs to compute money costs of any conceivable production process and compare costs to anticipated prices on the market. Now, what are some of the naive Marxist responses that occurred in the 1920s, mainly in Germany? The first was by the radical, fanatical Marxist Otto Neurath. And he said, well, what's the problem? We'll just add up the stuff that we're producing and compare it to the stuff that we're using to produce those goods. But so he's, in effect, actually believed you could add apples and oranges. It's crazy. You couldn't get a single unitary number, though, to let you know. I mean, you use tons of steel, kilowatts of electricity, gallons of paint. How do you add them all up to come up with a cost of production? So he was an idiot. You can calculate with labor hours, they said. Oh, well, look, every good uses labor in its production. But there's a number of things, of course, that's wrong with this. First of all, labor hours aren't all homogeneous. So there's different qualities, from software engineers to McDonald's cashiers to the hours of brain surgeons' labor. They're all different. They can't be added together. They're as different as apples and oranges when you come down to it. Also, it ignores the difference in the quality of labor. Is LeBron James really an hour of his labor, or two hours out on the court, to be compared to 2 hours of labor for the 12th guy on the bench who's gawky and barely can move around? No, basketball players in the same industry have different quality for their labor. So you can't calculate. Oh, and also, of course, goods are not just produced with labor, right? They're produced with more or less capital, more or less natural resources. So this completely leaves out of account capital goods and natural resources, which means they're not economized because they're not counted in the calculation. So that's a cretinous idea too. Assuming a stationary economy, this is one of their favorites. They say, look, capitalism produces, and we see what they're doing. We will just tell the managers, the capitalist managers, we'll get rid of the owners, but we'll tell the managers who are there on site, just do tomorrow, the first day of socialism, what you did today, and just keep doing it. Okay, now why is that stupid? It's dumb because that assumes that new technology never develops, natural resources are never depleted or never come online, are never discovered, and that consumer value scales never change. The whole point of having a price system is to deal with the reallocation of resources as things continually change, okay? As consumers change their tastes, as new and better products are developed, and so on. They wouldn't be able to handle that. They kept doing the same things. And as Murray Rothbard points out, in the first 3 months, everything might go all right, but then as you get further and further away from the actual economic data, the actual value scales and technology and resources, things will just start to fall apart, okay? As resources are depleted, capital goods wear out, and so on. Okay. All right, what about the more advanced solutions? I can just touch on these, I hardly have any time. There were sophisticated, well-trained neoclassical economists came up with responses in the 1930s when the Mises critique was brought to Great Britain and the United States by Hayek and others. And they have a number of solutions, trial and error method, in which you set prices, and if there's a surplus, then you lower the price. If there's a shortage, then you raise the price. Or market socialism. Under market socialism, you would have the planners setting the prices, and then the managers of the different firms using those prices to calculate, and then to sell the good and then to produce at the lowest possible cost, and then to sell the good at another price that is set by the planners. And if there were shortages and surpluses, then the planners would adjust the prices to make them go away. But the question is, where the hell did these prices come from? So they just made them up. They picked them out of a hat. Okay, so people who are followers of Mises, like Robbins and Hayek, pointed out that even if this solution could work, it would take a while for. How often are they going to change prices from the center? Okay, central planning of prices. Every 2 months, every 3 months. The market economy does it on a daily or moment-to-moment basis. They change prices as we see disequilibria. And second, how do you bring together, for the mathematical solution, where you bring together all the data about technology and tastes and resources, and you plug it into a set of simultaneous equations, and you solve them, and you get prices and quantities. But once again, Rothbard and Robbins, looking at the practicality of all this, said, well, there weren't any computers back then, so it would take months and months to solve the set of equations for a large economy. But not only that, it would take a long time to find out this knowledge. But by the time you got it, plugged it in, and then solved the equations, it would be outdated. It would be months outdated. So they kind of looked at the mathematical side of it. But Mises looked more deeply into the theoretical side, and he said, well, market socialism is playing market, because managers don't run the economy. It's not a managerial economy. It's an entrepreneurial economy. Owners run the economy. Owners destroy lines of production. They get rid of them, and they invest in new lines of production. They don't just follow prices going up or down and stay in the same business. They move across the economy with their capital. So that was a devastating critique. And he also pointed out that, and if you look around you today, all the capital goods in the United States right now are wrong. Wrong in the sense that if people who had built those capital goods years ago, in the case of railroads and airplanes 25 years ago and further, if they knew what consumer value skills would be today, they would not have built some of those capital goods. So those capital goods, we're still using them because they're still useful, but we want to know how quickly we should allow them to wear out and replace them with new capital goods that are better adjusted to what consumers want. So that's a very subtle argument that Mises came up with in Human Action. I don't expect you to grasp that right now, but basically, we have to, profits and losses continuously lead us to adjust our productive processes to what consumers want. Okay, thank you.